I try to wake people up because government is too big. They spend too much money. The deficits are out of control. But I always go back to the Federal Reserve, as you well know, because I think whether you're in the category you think we fight too many wars and the DOD wastes too much money, or whether it's the welfare state at home and on, and everybody talks about the $36 trillion deficit. But I don't believe that would be a problem if we didn't have a Federal Reserve, because that is the engine of inflation. That is the engine that nothing would be excessive, because if you couldn't just depend on the printing of money, so the politicians want to service their constituents and be reelected, no matter what they say about the deficit, they don't want to give up any spending that might keep them in office. So we hear that, but the spending continues. But the reason why they are encouraged, either the people or the politicians who spend, is we don't have to worry about it. We'll just declare an emergency. Oh, there's a hurricane, so we need $10 more billion. Oh, there's an invasion of Syria. We better spend more money. That sort of thing. But the Fed always comes to the rescue. They diminish the value of money. There's devaluation of money, and that's why the people suffer. I do believe there's a bubble there, and I do believe it always has to be dealt with, and there will be liquidation of the debt. And I believe there'll be liquidation of the mistakes made when they get the information from the interest rates, because interest rates tells business people, investors, people who buy and sell what to do. So they ruin it. People think wage and price control, that's not good. Well, the price control of money is not good either. And that is the big problem. I think interest rates would go up and prices would go up, and that would be part of the liquidation. Now, the Fed, they hope that they can reduce systematically and slowly real debt, and they can. If you have an inflation rate of 10%, real debt, goes down 10%. But there's a limit to that because it's automatic. It's out of control. This committee can't stop the interest payment. The interest payments are going up, and that's going to get worse because it's a pyramid scheme. In a way, it's a Ponzi scheme because it's automatic. He keeps building and building, and you don't have to appropriate the money. But if you mess around with it, there's a lot of pain and suffering. But if you move in a direction of weaning ourselves off, the pain and suffering will come. But if you don't do anything, there will be big pain and suffering because, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, those monetary systems, they don't end graceful. The pound was a reserve currency of the world. The pound survived, but they didn't survive the reserve service. I think that we should wean ourselves off, but I think the political forces are so strong, the military-industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industry, the whole works, the welfare state, they are not going to accept that, and then there will be consequence of this situation is actually violence. So we have to start weaning, and that's why I give credit to what Musk and the others are trying to do, is wean ourselves off. But I'm not all that optimistic that said the people will accept this. How are they going to stop the automatic increase in the interest payment on a debt that's expanding rapidly? And the way this usually works, it accelerates at the end.
Yes.
We're in the acceleration period right now. Well, I think it's very sincere, and if it happened, it would be okay. You could work our way out of this, but I just can't accept the fact that it'll happen. There will be too much revolutionary spirit on doing this because people will get hurt. You can't nibble away at the military payments. That's not going to happen. You can't say you start cutting with the pharmaceuticals, say then the little children won't have drugs. And it'll be on and on. And the emotionalism tied to that and the pain. It's sort of like telling somebody you have to have a surgery, and yet they say, well, I don't want to have the surgery. But this committee, it's just that over the years, I've watched it for many, many decades now of all these promises. Get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, government is wasteful, fraudulent, and abusive. So I don't expect government ever to do that. You have to turn the government over to the people. They're talking about management, and that is very good. And they're talking about getting rid of some of the bureaucrats. But believe me, there is a powerful force that runs Washington, and those are the special interests and the lobbyists, and they really control things behind. The big problem that the people, you might take a vote and say, oh yeah, we like what Trump, well, we just had a vote, and they said Trump's on the right track. But I'm a little bit cynical. I don't think it's going to work because I think the people who are going to be hurt by cutting spending are going to be very, very noisy. I just don't believe it's going to happen. I would support any cut at all, because from a libertarian viewpoint, the government is way out of control. From a constitutional viewpoint, it's way out of control. From a moral viewpoint. So I like the idea of a model that the founders gave us and nobody pays much attention to. Every member of Congress takes an oath of office. If they ever read the oath they take, we would have none of these problems, because nobody could do anything outside of Washington that wasn't explicitly authorized to do. So all of a sudden you'd have 80% of the government stopped, but we can't even stop 3% of the government. They sometimes have just trying to make a point. A member would come up and say, now we have this bill here, we're going to cut 1% off it. They can't even pass that because they're not going to reduce it because it's too easy to take the drug. And then they feel better. If you're an addict, you get the drug, you feel a lot better, but the patient finally dies. The big things that are not going to cut, whether it's the interest rates, whether it's the DOD, or whether it's Medicare or Medicaid, every campaign, even the last one, you can't vote for the Republicans because they might cut Social Security. And all those things are huge. Yep. And where does the government? They should always ask the politicians, president, where are you going to get the money? Do you have the money in the bank? Do you have it in your checking account? Like if you go buy a car, you have to have the money. No, you have to borrow. They go back to say, where's the money? They say, we'll borrow it. Well, nobody's going to loan the government that much money. I think the Fed will help us. It goes back to the Fed. Fed is the backbones of this whole system, because it wouldn't be this size if you didn't have a reserve currency of the world that's doing still better than it deserves. And as long as they're privy to this, there's a lot of people invested in the dollars. The world runs on the dollar. So it's the economic laws they should be convinced of. And the economic law said that this bubble can't just keep getting bigger without bursting. I think in the past, in my lifetime, I can remember where I thought both parties were onto something because they were both opposed to tariffs. But they come and go, and the parties do it back and forth. The short term, tariffs looks like an answer, but tariffs are a tax. People pay more for it. So the consumer is hurt, and they have been taken away. What they have lost is their choice. They might say, well, I can get tennis shoes from China at 50% of what they would be if I have to make them here in the United States. Well, why should you say you can't buy shoes from China? Why don't you get them for 50%? And then you'll have 50% of your money. You can go buy something else. So I think it's a tax, and it's a tax on the small consumer. The middle class and the poor will suffer a lot more from the tariffs. Sometimes the tariffs are very helpful to big corporations because it might give a boost to them. But one of the worst things that can happen is a trade war. Yes, they're going to retaliate. You already hear about that. And trade wars are not good. There's a good history behind the fact that when the trade wars come, there's more likely militancy that grows because people get angry over what's happening. I believe the people who are pushing these tariffs right now are very sincere, and they can see some short-term benefits, but I think that they do not solve the problem. That is the reason Adam Smith was strongly opposed to it, and the majority of the major economists since then have generally said tariffs are risky, we better not mess around. Everybody gets to make their own choice. If you have $1,000 and you want to spend it, you have a right to spend it any place you want. It is a matter of voluntarism. But if you start to manage it at all, it becomes very difficult because some people will be helped and other people will not be helpful. But I don't think that people would be willing to do that. They're going to be very annoyed by this because how are you going to manage it? We have to hire bureaucrats to manage a complicated set of tariffs and sanctions and all that activity. I think the people ought to make the decision on how to spend their money if there's war going on, if there's a declaration of war and serious war. But you can't just willy-nilly say, they're undercutting our steel people, they're undercutting our car people, so we have to keep them out of our country. We'll punish our consumer. They'll have to pay more for it, and that'll settle it. No, that stirs up a trade war, very dangerous.